What if I told you that one freezing winter, behind towering stone walls and burning seas of fire, just 10,000 exhausted defenders stood between civilization and collapse, and when the dust settled, an empire had failed, and a city refused to fall? This is the story of the siege that saved Constantinople, when courage, strategy, and unbreakable walls shattered the ambition of a vast invading force. In the early 8th century, the mighty armies of the Umayyad Caliphate marched west with unstoppable momentum, sweeping across North Africa, crossing into Spain, and pressing deep into the heart of Europe, and at the center of their vision stood the greatest prize of the Christian world, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire, a city of wealth, faith, and power that had defied conquerors for centuries. But this time the threat was unlike any before it, because the invaders did not come as raiders seeking plunder, they came as empire builders determined to break the last Roman stronghold and claim it forever. In 717 AD, a massive land and naval force advanced toward the city, their banners stretching across the horizon, their fleets darkening the waters of the Bosporus, their commanders confident that starvation and fear would accomplish what brute force could not. And inside the city walls stood barely 10,000 defenders, soldiers, sailors, militia, and citizens, men who understood that surrender meant annihilation, that if the city fell, the gateway between Asia and Europe would swing open, and nothing would stand between the conquerors and the fractured kingdoms beyond. Fear was real, supplies were limited, and winter was approaching, but the city was not unprepared, because its greatest weapon was not just its soldiers, but its walls, the legendary Theodosius Walls, a triple-layered system of stone and moat that had repelled Huns, Persians, and countless invaders before, and now those walls would face one of the largest siege operations the medieval world had ever seen, as enemy engineers constructed siege towers and battering rams, while their navy blockaded the harbor, in hopes of cutting off all food and reinforcement. And yet within those walls, a new emperor had just risen to power, a hardened general named Leo III, who understood that survival would not come from passive defense alone, but from calculated aggression, patience, and psychological warfare. And so as the siege tightened, as enemy soldiers filled the fields outside the city and ships sealed the sea, the defenders prepared for a battle that would test not only their strength but their endurance, knowing that time itself would become the most powerful weapon of all. As summer faded and the siege settled into a brutal stalemate, the invading army expected quick cracks in morale. Yet Constantinople did not bend, because every assault met layered resistance. Every attempt to storm the outer defenses forced attackers into narrow killing zones, where arrows, stones, and burning projectiles rained down relentlessly, and the defenders used height, engineering, and discipline to multiply their small numbers into an unbreakable shield. Meanwhile at sea, the enemy fleet attempted to dominate the Golden Horn, believing naval superiority would starve the city into submission. But they underestimated a terrifying Byzantine secret weapon, Greek fire, a liquid inferno launched from siphon tubes mounted on ships, clinging to wood and flesh, burning even atop water, turning the dark sea into a floating nightmare. And when the defending fleet unleashed it, entire squadrons of enemy vessels erupted in uncontrollable flames, panic spreading faster than the fire itself, as sailors leapt into burning waters only to discover the flames followed them, and the psychological impact was devastating, because suddenly the besiegers realized that their numerical superiority meant nothing against a weapon they could neither predict nor extinguish. Still the siege dragged on, because empires do not retreat easily, and the Umayyad commanders tightened the noose, cutting supply routes, and waiting for hunger to do their work. But winter arrived early and harsh, and the besieging army, camped in open fields, far from reliable supply chains, began to suffer first. Snow blanketed their tents, disease spread through cramped quarters, food grew scarce, and horses died in the cold. While inside the city, rationing and stored grain sustained the population. Just long enough, and Leo III seized the moment, coordinating surprise sorties beyond the walls, striking isolated units, capturing supplies, and retreating before larger forces could respond, slowly bleeding the invaders' strength. Diplomacy also played its part, as alliances with neighboring powers disrupted reinforcements and harassed enemy supply lines from the rear, turning what was meant to be a swift conquest into a grinding disaster. And morale shifted visibly, because the narrative of inevitable victory began to crumble under frostbite, famine, and fire, and with each failed. Assault on the walls, each fleet destroyed by Greek fire, each week that passed without breakthrough, the psychological balance tilted toward the defenders, who now fought not with desperation but with rising confidence, while the massive invading force, once so certain of triumph, began to understand that they were trapped in a siege of their own making, vulnerable, exhausted, and increasingly aware that the city they sought to conquer was consuming them instead. By the time spring approached, the reality was undeniable. The empire that had marched across continents had been halted by stone, strategy, and stubborn resilience, and as disease ravaged the camps and supply lines collapsed entirely, retreat became the only option. But even withdrawal proved catastrophic, because storms battered the remaining fleet, additional attacks shattered retreating units, and what began as one of the most ambitious campaigns in early medieval history ended in fragmentation and staggering losses, and Constantinople stood, scarred but undefeated, its defenders, fewer in number but greater in legend, having proven that discipline could outmatch scale, that preparation could defeat ambition, and that geography combined with innovation could alter the fate of continents. The failure of the siege did more than save a city. It reshaped the balance of power for generations, halting further expansion into southeastern Europe for decades, and granting the Byzantine world precious time to recover, reorganize, and fortify. And historians would later recognize this moment as one of the pivotal turning points in European history, because had those walls fallen in 717, the political, cultural, and religious map of Europe might have transformed beyond recognition. And yet the victory did not belong to vast armies or reckless charges. It belonged to patience, engineering brilliance, naval innovation, calculated leadership, and the unyielding will of 10,000 defenders who refused to surrender their city to fate. And so the story of the battle that saved Constantinople endures not merely as a tale of war, but as a reminder that empires are not invincible, that momentum can be broken, and that sometimes the line between collapse and survival is drawn not by the size of an army, but by the strength of those who stand behind their walls and decide that they will not fall.